Welcome to Democracy Docket's 100-day Trump administration live event. I'm excited to have you all here. We have an exciting and really knowledgeable panel of experts about everything involving democracy, the courts, election administration, the Trump administration, the litigation against the Trump administration. We're going to cover all of that today for you. But before we get to that, to me introducing the panel, I want to point out that we are going to discuss the four most probable paths to a constitutional crisis in this country. We're also going to be trying, though, to address your questions and your comments. So there is a chat. Feel free to put your comments and questions there. We have people monitoring that, and they will be feeding them to me throughout the next hour. I wrote in an exclusive newsletter for our premium members a month ago. And there have been a lot of developments since then, including facts that I would argue lead us to conclude that we are actually in a constitutional crisis. But in broad strokes, the four paths that I laid out have remained unchanged. That is that the courts will fail us, that elections will no longer be free and fair, that the rule of law could get so degraded and undermined that we no longer really have rule of law, and that federalism could become overrun. So for those of us who are in this space, these are the things we spend all of our days worrying about, all of our days litigating for a number of us, and all of our days trying to educate others about. I want to now turn to and introduce our panel of special guests, and they are really an amazing group. First, I want to introduce Hannah Fried. I have known her for many, many years. She has been in almost every capacity that you would want to be in if you wanted to, understand the full ways in which elections are administered. She is right now the co-founder and executive director of All Voting is Local, as well as AVL Action, it's C4. And this is the preeminent and premier organization that is on the ground helping make sure that local election officials have the resources and the knowledge base they need to do their job, and that local elections, that elections for local, state, and federal office all run without a hitch. Prior to this role, she served as the national director and deputy general counsel for voter protection on Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign. She served in a similar leadership role for President Obama's reelection effort in Florida and at the Democratic National Committee. And so welcome, Hannah Fried. We are also joined by Skye Perryman. Skye Perryman is the president and CEO of Democracy Forward. This is an organization I helped co-found in 2017. And she was part of the Democracy Forward founding legal team. Prior to joining as the CEO, she served as the chief legal officer and general counsel of the American College of Obstetrician and Gynecologists. And we were really, really lucky to get her back after she had been at Democracy Forward and then left, and now she came back, and she, like I said, is the CEO and the president of Democracy Forward right now is, in my view, the leading organization holding Donald Trump accountable in the courts. She will have more to say on that, but they have brought 60 separate lawsuits and are winning cases all throughout the country. She was also named one of 2025's 100 most influential people in the world by Time magazine. And finally, we're joined by Harry Litman. Harry is a good friend. He is a lawyer, a law professor, a legal journalist. He's the former U.S. he's a former U.S. attorney and deputy assistant attorney general at the Department of Justice. He is the creator, host, and executive producer of Talking Feds. That is a podcast. It is a YouTube channel. It is on Substack. If you are not subscribed to Talking Feds on all of those platforms, you are missing out. Because he is really one of the most foremost experts on everything involving legal issues, and particularly what the Department of Justice and U.S. attorneys offices are up to. He is also the senior legal affairs columnist for the New Republic and a senior fellow at the USC Annenberg Center and Communications Leadership on Communications Leadership and Policy. So welcome, panelists, one and all.
Thanks.
All right.
Great.
All right. I want to kick this off by talking about the first of these areas, which is, we hear a lot of people talk about whether we're in a constitutional crisis, and they almost always mean are the courts failing? And these come in kind of like two flavors. The first is, are the courts ruling the way they need to in order to hold Donald Trump and the administration accountable? And the second is Donald Trump and the administration following the court's orders when they hold him accountable? So I'm going to throw this first to you, Skye, because you are literally in court seemingly not even every day, every hour of every day. And so how do you assess where we are in terms of the courts holding or the courts folding?
I think in terms of how they're ruling, the courts are holding, and you're seeing court orders being issued by judges that were appointed by Democratic presidents, by Republican presidents, by Donald Trump himself, including on issues, for instance, like the Dear Colleague education letter, which involves diversity, equity, and inclusion, where you wouldn't necessarily think that a judge that was appointed by Donald Trump, that would be an issue where they're ruling against him. And we're even seeing him on those types of issues because of how unlawful the administration is operating. So I think the courts are ruling. We've not seen the Supreme Court rubber stamp everything that the president is doing, which is something that some people anticipated they would. We've not seen that. So the courts are holding in that way. That has, of course, unleashed backlash from the Trump administration. And in a lot of our cases right now, and in a lot of cases that our colleagues are litigating at other organizations, we are seeing the administration try to skirt court orders, and in some instances taking the position they don't have to comply with them. The courts are responding forcefully. You've seen a number of judges, again, across the ideological spectrum, make it clear that they expect their court orders to be followed. You saw the Supreme Court do that. So I think that is a, like, not burying the lead. That is really good, because a lot of people did not think that the courts would do that across the board. That said, we are certainly in a place that is really concerning, because the administration, at least in some cases, including in a case that we're litigating alongside our friends at the ACLU, the Alien Enemies Act case before Judge Boasberg, have engaged in very callous conduct, seeking to take the position that they don't have to follow certain orders. In that case, we've had the first ruling from a judge that there is probable cause that the administration engaged in even contempt of court. So this is getting to a boiling point. I'm not minimizing it, but I do think the courts are holding.
And so just one real quick follow-up question on that. The case you mentioned before, Judge Boasberg, this is one of the cases involving people being sent to the Salvadorian gulag, right? These are the Venezuelan who were sent there. How do you see the interaction of what the Trump administration is doing in that case with what they are doing in other cases? In other words, is there like a unified strategy on the Trump administration to follow or not follow court orders? Or is it just like whichever DOJ lawyer they grab at any one time that Stephen Miller can call? It runs differently.
Well, certainly in that case, it's clear that the politicals, the people that were installed by President Trump, are calling the shots. There was a great New York Times piece yesterday that probably many folks that are tuning in read, about just how extreme Stephen Miller, as well as others in the Justice Department, not just the White House, are being in that case. But I will tell you, in many of our cases, it's a bit different. In many of our cases, the administration, and I'm not trying to normalize this because it's not normal, but we will go in and we will win a court order, which, by the way, is hard to do. And people are doing a lot of it because of how, and I don't know if I'm freezing a little bit or if the Riverside's freezing, but we will go in and win a court order. And then what will happen is it's almost like a toddler. Like the next day, you got to be ready to get into court and to tell the court, we need a compliance schedule. We need to check on the government. What are they doing? Because if you're not really being vigilant as a lawyer, the government will try to skirt the order, but they're not going so far as to say they don't have to comply with the order altogether, making arguments that don't even stand, the smell test about this was an oral order versus a written order. So we are seeing that, I think, in immigration cases, and then potentially in some of the civil rights cases, the administration tends to be taking a more brazen approach, whereas in other cases, the administration is not taking the approach that we would believe they need to take to comply with the court orders, but it is a bit less extreme. That's what we're seeing right now.
Harry, you are as keen an observer of everything going on in the courts as anyone, and certainly when it comes to Donald Trump and the administration. You also have the virtue of having been a government lawyer, so you've been on the other side where you don't like the outcome of a case. What do you make of what the Trump administration is doing from a strategic standpoint and how the courts are handling?
Yeah, I think, Mark, it's still the jury's a little out. Trump repeatedly says he will obey the Supreme Court. But I think, first of all, I agree with Skye. It's been, especially at the district court level, a really impressive performance across the board. Some 123 grants of injunctions against the excessive orders, and today maybe the strongest of all by a Trump appointee in the Southern District of Texas, actually rejecting, it's the first time it's been served up, the administration's view on the Alien Enemies Act and the notion that somehow these collection of Tren de Aragua in the country constitute an incursion by a foreign country. I would have thought, it seemed to me, and I agree that I was feeling pretty sanguine in what I'd call like the penultimate question, which is whether the courts will, in fact, insist on some kind of role and as forceful as they can be in the 9-0 opinion by the Supreme Court in the Abrego Garcia case, the 7-2 in the Boasberg case. Were really, actually was 9-0 with a little bit of a wrinkle in the Boasberg case, are testament to that. But just of late, including the last couple of days, you hear this sort of prevarication, including from the likes of Rubio. It's always been the case with Miller. And to me, the $64,000 question is, will they in fact, they'll clearly do certain bobbing and weaving and the dog ate my homework kinds of excuses, but will it come, flat out to a, we defy what you have to say? And I think there the jury is still out. Now, there are all kinds of other cases. Skye mentioned, for instance, the Education Act cases that by and large are going well. I think the big distinction to keep our eyes on there is less who appointed the judges and more, are we at the district court, the Court of Appeals, or the Supreme Court level? But those to me are all of a flavor of Trump 1.0. I can imagine some really lousy, depressing decisions coming out of the courts, even being approved by the Supreme Court that give him approve certain assertions of outlandish power. But to me, I've kept my eye on, are they actually going to be brought to heel when the Supreme Court says so? And right now, I think the jury is tending toward this court will say so. And it's still, to me, a little bit unclear whether or not, notwithstanding the things Trump has to say, they will precipitate a full-on constitutional crisis by saying, sorry, we're not going to comply with what you say.
Okay, so, one of the questions we're already getting in the chat, and we had lots of people write in advance about this, and I'm sure every one of you gets asked this question. What happens if the Trump administration doesn't comply? We've heard, I think Judge Boasberg in Washington, D.C. has suggested criminal contempt. There are other people saying maybe there should be civil contempt. People don't know what the hell the difference that is. There are other people saying, that, the judges can issue fines. Other people say, what about putting people in jail? Like, what is your take on what the courts can do and what that showdown looks like?
Starting with me, did you mean?
Yeah, Harry.
Okay, I've thought about this quite.
You're the only government. I think you're the only one. No, that's not. I think Skye was a government lawyer, but you get to be the erstwhile government lawyer who had to face this.
I'm happy to, because I've thought, well, I wouldn't want to be a government lawyer these days where they send you in and you basically have to say, I don't know, no one told me. I've thought about this a lot, though, and this is, you said up front, are we in a constitutional crisis? Aren't we? Are the wheels sort of off the cliff, or is the car, going down in the gravel? This is the ultimate question, and I think if it happens, it's a kind of, rules of battle like we haven't had even in the Civil War. But what can be assembled on one side, I think, I'm relatively sanguine if we get to that point, but we are talking about popular opposition, state and federal power. And the courts, by the way, will take a while to get there. They'll first say, honest, we mean it. No, really, we mean it. No, now we mean it. But if they are repeatedly disobeyed, I think it will actually raise the question of where are the American people, and will popular opposition carry the day? And the big point there, I think, Mark, as I think about it, is unlike a couple distinctions, one way to say that sentence is, will we become Hungary? Will we become Poland? Will we become Chile? And I think for two reasons, even as bad as I think everything that is happening is, I'm fairly sanguine. First, I think in the country, we just have a lot more cultural ballast and devotion from, day one and the Pledge of Allegiance to everyone in the country. 85% of this kind of doesn't agree on anything. 85% agrees if the courts go that way, they should be listened to. And so I think the level of popular opposition, including if he brings out, you've heard J.D. Vance say that's what the Insurrection Act is for, is going to be too strong. It would be one thing if they were on the other side already, as in Hungary, where there are elections, but the game is totally rigged. At this point, where he hasn't prevailed and he's at 42%, I think it's actually a kind of square off of popular opposition plus, and that's an ultimate kind of Armageddon type battle that I think he's not going to be able to prevail in. But obviously, that's a very, bleak, almost science fiction, or would have looked like, assessment. But that is really where we are. If he says, marshals, tell the judges to go take a hike. Army, I don't care what you say, etc. What's left? The people, and maybe some level of state and federal government, which I know you want to talk about at the end.
So, Hannah, before there was Donald Trump, the authoritarian, there was Donald Trump, the election denier, right? And so the first battles that we saw with Donald Trump in the courts actually were in your arena, around the ability to run free and fair elections, around local election officials being targeted and demonized by Donald Trump. So what do you make of the state of elections as it relates to the courts? I'm going to turn to you in a minute to talk about what it means for free and fair election more generally, but you could say the courts have been successful in protecting local administration of elections and free and fair elections. You could also say, they didn't stop January 6th, and they didn't stop, Shea Moss from being targeted. So what's your perspective on this?
Well, I mean, look, I'll take you a little bit back in time, which is when we started all voting as local and naval action. And this was 2017, 2018. And the reason that we started the organization to focus on the decisions that state and local election officials make and to get out ahead of problems was because the courts were becoming increasingly unfriendly. I mean, this was a few years after Shelby, right? We had just had this major loss from a civil rights and voting rights standpoint. And I'm referring here to the case that gutted core protections of the Voting Rights Act. And so, look, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm a lawyer, a lot of lawyers here, probably a lot of
lawyers. We got lawyers.
All lawyers. We work with a ton of litigators, and they are doing the Lord's work. I think, though, that what we also have seen in the last few years is that without question, we have to be fighting these fights on different fronts. And that means getting out ahead of problems, preventing them, calling on officials to lean into the power that they have to protect voting rights, and to call on state legislators to take action to protect the right to vote at the state level as well.
Yeah. Okay. So this brings me to the second topic that I wanted to discuss about how democracy could end, which is we no longer have free and fair elections. So I'll just state my base case, Hannah, and then throw it to you, okay, and for others to critique. We're going to have elections in 2026. So like the people who are like, why do you think we're going to have elections? Like, we're going to have elections. The question is not whether we're going to have elections. The question is, how much do they resemble or don't resemble what we have come to expect as free and fair elections? We have seen over the course of the last 40 years, elections becoming more and more accessible. You saw the increased use of vote by mail. You saw the increased use of early vote. You saw the increased use of online voter registration, same day voter registration. You really saw for a long period of time a bipartisan consensus to make elections easier and to give election officials more power and flexibility to serve the voters. Then we saw kind of a reversal or attack on that after 2020. You might put it earlier than that, but let's just say 2020 was certainly not a walk in the park. And now we are seeing Donald Trump through executive order and through pressure and through Congress, through funding and through cutting things like CISA and other and other things, really trying to undermine the ability of local election officials to do their jobs. So what is your level of concern? What is your, what's your base case for kind of what 2026 looks like?
Yeah, so I think your assessment is totally spot on. I think we can say a lot of things about this moment that we're in. One thing we can say is that we are surprised. The administration and its allies, and I'm talking about Congress, but I'm also talking about folks at the state level. They've been telling us for years what they are planning. We have got Project 2025. We have statements certainly from the president recently and in years past about plans to gut early voting, gut vote by mail. We have the SAVE Act coming out of Congress, which would, of course, require voters to show, or Americans to show a passport or a birth certificate to register to vote. And we have a whole lot of copycat bills that look just like that at the state level as well. We are, without question, we are in full-scale attack mode on the right to vote, right? That targets people directly, voters directly. The stuff that we're talking about making people show a passport before they can register to vote, rolling back access to vote by mail, which we know people love to use, right? All of that is a direct attack on people's ability to register to vote. And I will say, those attacks are, to quote a judge about a North Carolina case, surgically targeting voters of color, right? And the attack also isn't just about voters. And I think this is actually one of the things that sets the moment we're in apart the most from where this country has been, of course, for centuries, right? Voter suppression is not a new problem. Restricting voter access is not a new problem. It's been with us since the country's founding. But the thing that is different is the direct attacks on the system itself. You mentioned Shay Moss, right? We're talking about direct attacks on election workers, right? The people who run our election systems, the neighborhood clerk that you get to know, they are facing harassment and intimidation, right? And then we have new people coming in to run elections who are avowed election deniers and vote suppressors, right? We're seeing that kind of rhetoric and language come from the US Attorney General. We're seeing that rhetoric and language come from a statewide election official in Wisconsin and from lots of local election officials too. So I would say we cannot underestimate the seriousness, intensity, and commitment of the people who are seeking to undermine our elections. We also, though, see a lot of hope out of the field. I imagine we'll get a chance to talk about that a little bit. It is certainly not all lost, not even close.
We always do hope.
We always do. We should.
Skye, let me have you pick up something that Hannah said. She mentioned Project 2025. And I think one of the things that I am proudest of about Democracy Forward, that I hope you are equally proud of, in addition to all the courtroom victories you have, is that you guys took Project 2025 literally and seriously. There were a lot of people who took it seriously but not literally, and I think you guys prepared as if they actually meant not the thematic crazy but the actual crazy. And so talk a little bit about how that Project 2025 preparation, but also how the substance of it matches up with what you are seeing actually coming out of the Trump administration and the arguments that DOJ is making.
Yeah, I mean, look, it was a blueprint. We're seeing they're operating in an accelerated fashion to accelerate the blueprint, which they have to do, by the way, because it is deeply unpopular with the vast majority of Americans, including people that identify as more conservative, which is why the president was untruthful on the campaign trail about his about his relationship to it. And now they're seeking to accelerate it because it's obviously not going to be able to pick up any steam among the people. And so they're trying to ram it through. We see the Department of Justice making a number of arguments that are straight out of that playbook. Everything from suggesting that somehow the executive branch is above other branches, which is inconsistent with centuries of law in this country, to more minor things, but things that have a really major impact, like arguing that certain longstanding protections, things like the Impoundment Control Act, which means that the president actually has to spend the funds that Congress appropriates, because he has to take care to see that the laws are faithfully executed under our Constitution. That those types of laws are unconstitutional, like overall. And so you're seeing an accelerated playbook play out. In the voting context, but certainly in all the contexts that we work on. And there's been some analyses done that says about a third of it they've already sought to implement it. What Project 2025 didn't have the guts to come out and admit that it was going to do, or maybe it just wasn't on the bingo card, was the role that Elon Musk is playing kind of in the government, and the role that Doge is playing, which, by the way, no one at the government will be straight from day to day, hour to hour about what it's actually doing. And the courts, I think, are doing a good job of sort of what we say in Texas, like get all the liars in the same room and see what's happening, all the stories that are being told. So that's playing out, but that wasn't there. And I think that has really shocked the system in a lot of ways. It's both created the distraction that we know that the Trump administration likes because people focus on it, as opposed to maybe focusing on the fact that people are being removed from the country without process and all these other perverse things. And at the same time, the Doge bros and Elon Musk are trying to do real damage, including messing with data throughout the federal government that, of course, you're challenging, Mark, and in the voting EO case, but really seeking to be quite perverse within the systems of the federal government in ways that could really undermine both the ability of people to vote and engage with their government and our overall privacy. So I think, that wasn't on the bingo card, but a lot of it was.
So, Harry, you've seen this across administrations, and you've seen this across issue areas. One of the questions that we're getting in the chat and from folks online is about the weaponization, and we're going to talk separately about weaponization more broadly. But we have seen U.S. attorneys' offices announce election integrity units. We've seen the Department of Justice, the Civil Rights Division, basically under Harmeet Dillon, say they're not really interested in voting rights; they're interested in, in election integrity. What's your base case for 2026?
Yeah,
what do you
let me
think
make a few broad points. So first, to Skye's point, here's a fairly big thing: the complete disassembly of the voting rights section of civil rights. So they really are absent. To my mind, Mark, the Dems have been playing on a slanted board maybe for 20 years. It's all based on the pushback from the Republicans has gotten more vigorous, robust, systematic. You got to pity the poor Shamas's of the world who, just showed up and now they're all of a sudden in the epicenter of activity. But I think it's already been a game in which, in part because the entire rhetorical push of the Republicans is a lie, right? That we don't have very fraudulent elections, and that's where the pushing goes. But I think the combination of the Electoral College, we got it. It's a constitution. There you have it. And the court's basic solicitude here. The Supreme Court's been really rough on essentially democratic rights, letting privileged interests sort of have their way. Means to me, it's already been an uphill battle. But if I focus on the premise of this whole hour and what you've laid out, I think it gets a little harder. They push a little bit more. But the question is, do we arrive at a point? Look, there are elections in Hungary, right? There are elections in Russia, but everyone knows they're preordained. Here, I think the Dems, it's true that Trump won popular vote by a little, but that was a surprise. They've been really at a sort of 6-5 disadvantage from the start, and it could be 6.5. Could be 7, but it's really can they actually seal up the whole thing with rules that make even a majority impossible to win the vote, including in how it's counted, et cetera. But to me here, basically, it was a pretty rough story even before 2016. And Dems have had to fight really hard to be, against a series of provisions that pass in individual states or even nationwide that everybody knows are meant to selectively disenfranchise Democrats over Republicans. The court is withdrawn from gerrymandering. The court has, for really pretty poor reasons, have said forget about the Voting Rights Act, Section 5. So I think the story here was already kind of bad, but if you mean does it take us over the cliff in and of itself, then everything Hannah and Skye talking about are real and important, and it's sort of hand-to-hand combat.
All right, I want to pivot to our next potential crisis point, which is that the rule of law becomes undermined in a fundamental way, that there's just not equal justice. And Harry, I want to pick up on the point that sort of the end of the point that you were making. I wrote a piece for Democracy Docket today about the presumption of regularity. And this is the idea that, on a whole, we assume that when the government does something, they do it in good faith. Yeah. We assume that when government lawyers say that they did something or that they're taking those positions, their representations are true, that presidents and administrations are acting lawfully. And that is sort of a bedrock position that, by the way, and I had a conversation with Dan Goldman, who is a member of Congress now from New York, but a former federal prosecutor. And he said, look, one of the problems with the whole weaponization of government and the whole arbitrariness of the administration is that it means that even in non-political prosecutions, the juries will be skeptical that they're even-handed. Everyone, once you start to undermine an even notion of balanced scales and the level playing field, everyone becomes more suspicious that the rule of law is actually even-handed. So I am wondering not just whether you worry about the weaponization of government or the undermining of regularity in the executive branch, but also the second and third order effects that it has to public confidence, that cynicism in the political process grows. I'm just curious how you unpack all of that.
Yeah, it's a great point. I just want to do an asterisk that this first order stuff and some of the things they've done are just mind-blowing and completely intolerable. But your point is a really good one. Everybody within the Department of Justice, there's a sort of sense of pride. Hannah freed for the United States, and you stand up and you've got a certain measure of credibility. That's out the window as far as I can tell. In this respect, I don't know if I'd call it in and of itself a constitutional crisis, Mark, but he has had an unbelievable inroad on, or his rule has coincided with an unbelievable inroad on people's trust in the law. It's really stunning, and I don't think it's confined to the MAGA faithful who think everything is fake and everything is a lie. But we're in a sort of a laboratory experiment now as to whether a democracy can survive when so many of its members just don't believe in it and think the law is bogus and a plaything of certain different privileged interests. So I'll just say that the second and third order effects have been so profound, and among other things, they have made if you go inside the Department of Justice anywhere today, but especially Washington, you'll find like a post-apocalyptic landscape with zombies walking around. People are really completely discouraged about the ability even to encounter juries, encounter judges, and have people believe in facts and the truth, which is another kind of casualty of the Trump era. So I'll just say it's huge, and how corrosive it'll be. We have this general set of questions that if and when the democratic experiment survives, how much work is there to do to bring us back to where we were? And this is a rich, nuanced cultural question, right? Will my grandchildren's grandchildren, again, believe in the rule of law and a certain America that we all did, man, it's a huge question that I think comes down ultimately to your day-to-day quality of life in a democracy.
Skye,
I might just jump in.
Yeah, I was going to say you should jump in here because you're the one having to hold together the rule of law with Scott.
Yeah, I'll be interested, Hannah, how you're seeing. Yeah, and I'll be interested, Hannah, how you're seeing this on the ground. But let me say a few things. I mean, one, I do want to say I think we've seen unbelievable courage from people, including government lawyers, who are doing everything they can to operate consistent with their professional responsibility. The Trump administration has, whenever the government lawyers do that, they've taken steps to put them on administrative leave or fire them. But I do want to say that this is a special country and it is a special system, that you have people who are actually being incentivized right now by their bosses and by their jobs to do something opposite. And you have people with a fidelity to the Constitution and the rule of law. And while some of the large law firms have, and Mark has been, outspoken about this, while some of the large law firms have capitulated, I think when you look at the lawyers that are truly coming out of the woodwork across the country in small firms, medium-sized firms, people that don't have the resources that these large institutions do to say, what can we do to help? We stand with the rule of law. Over the weekend, ABC News came out with a poll that was really interesting because it said that the majority of people in this country believe Trump has gone too far, and they have concerns about what he's doing with the rule of law. That, by the way, it's not that the democracy is not some election or winning issue. Maybe people didn't believe it could happen here, but now that they're becoming convinced that it will and is happening here, you're seeing a much different uptake on those types of questions. So I think the government certainly doesn't deserve a presumption of regularity in really any of the cases that we're in right now, even the ones that aren't making headline news about planes that weren't turned around or what have you. But in terms of the legal profession, I think that some of the lead that doesn't need to be buried is that we are seeing the profession and its professional ethics hold, even when some of the biggest institutions, whether it's the Department of Justice or elite law firms, aren't holding in some instances. Individual lawyers are. And I think that there's something to really focus on that. And that, of course, is what the On Tyranny, talks about, the need for people to really pay attention to their professional ethics and those things. We're taking that very seriously. Hannah, I'm interested if you've seen sort of similar things from the ground.
Yeah, and Hannah, I want to add one more thing before you jump in.
Yeah.
If there's one part of our democracy that requires public confidence, it is election administration. I mean, I sometimes describe the election process, and I feel now like, people roll their eyes given what we're seeing out of the Trump administration. But it is truly the pageantry of democracy. I mean, it is the place where, we celebrate people getting, registering and voting and getting a sticker, and we celebrate, we have a history of celebrating the near volunteers who are working at those tables for long hours. And then when the election's over, we have a history in this country of Democrats and Republican election workers shaking hands and congratulating themselves on a job well done. And so I'm really, really interested in your perspective on what Skye's asking, given that it is probably more important for your work than anyone's work that we have this sense.
Yeah, we're on the ground in 8 states, and in every single one of them, what we see consistently is elections officials who are following the law, doing their job, and doing their duty to the communities that they're supposed to serve. Whatever. I mean, look, I'm an advocate, and so my work is focused on the times when we don't see that happening, right? And in the fall leading up to the November elections in 2024, I was real worried and real active on making sure that elections were going to get certified and results were going to get respected and upheld. That said, the overwhelming majority of these state and local election officials are doing exactly what they are supposed to. They are certifying election results, and it is their duty to do so. It's just that now I think we are operating in a context in which that is not only their duty, but it does require some courage to be front and center and say, I'm doing this no matter how much pressure you put on me. And they are doing this sometimes in the face of quite a lot of pressure. We have elections officials in places like Georgia who are being asked to, remove people from the voter rolls, or Pennsylvania, where there were in October and November hundreds of voter challenges, right? And the elections officials did exactly what they were supposed to do, which is that they looked at the evidence, so-called, being provided to them, and they said, these are valid voters and valid votes, and we will not throw them out. Same thing with elections officials in places like Washoe County, who initially in the primaries voted not to certify, and then were like, my God, this is actually my duty. And you know what? They went ahead and they certified that election result. And I will say, part of what leads that to happen is communities, right? That courage is also being reflected in communities themselves, who are continuing. They were in the fall, and we see it on the ground in the field right now. They're going to Board of Elections meetings. They're going to their state legislators, and they're saying, you have to make voting more accessible. You have to count our votes. Look, this job is hard. This work can be a real grind, but seeing that persistence and that courage, when no one should have to be so resilient to vote, no one should have to be so resilient to administer an election, but you know what, they are. And that means that we all have to stick with them too.
All right, I want to pivot, Hannah, with you to our last topic. And that is what I call federalism overrun. And I'll start by saying that federalism is a concept that historically conservatives are very comfortable with. Skye, you're from Texas. You're familiar with the concept of states' rights and state prerogatives. But it is also an important principle for progressives to keep in mind, particularly in this era, where Donald Trump does not respect the separation of powers between Congress and the judiciary and the executive branch. He doesn't respect the checks and balances within the executive branch. And he certainly, and I don't believe it respects the authority of the states and state actors to have their prerogatives. One of the places where it is clearest, Hannah, is in the area of elections. The Constitution makes clear that it is that as George Will, a good rock rib conservative, used to say, we don't have federal elections. We have state elections for federal offices. And you operate, Hannah, at the most local federalism level of those elections. How much do you worry, whether it is executive orders from Donald Trump trying to impinge on those through the EAC, or whether it is something that could be more catastrophic to local election administration? Remember, this was in 2020. Donald Trump, toyed with the idea of an executive order to have essentially the Department of Justice or the military take action in elections. How do you prepare? How much do you worry about it? How do you prepare for it? How do local election officials prepare for this? How are things going?
Well, let me offer a couple of thoughts. First, the Constitution really could not be more clear that it is states and Congress, not the executive branch, that regulates federal elections. So that's a good starting place to think about your question. It helps. It helps. I will say it does. I think, I'm sort of the mind, and Skye, I've heard you make a similar point, that, our institutions here, our election systems will hold, but people will have to be courageous to make sure that that is actually the case. And I say that not because there's any lack of clarity here about who gets to make these decisions, but because I would like to minimize the pain that we all have to go through as we figure that out and land in the right final place. And the good news is that elections officials have demonstrated that they are going to be pretty courageous. Look, it is a little bit of an idiosyncrasy that we have literally thousands of election jurisdictions in this country and thousands of election administrators. And that does mean that the way that a person votes in one county may look a little different from how they vote in the next county. But the good news is that it is also an enormous protection right now when we have a central figure, a president, who is interested in using the administration of elections to tilt things in his own favor. It becomes a lot harder to do that when you have just so very many election jurisdictions. And I'll say the courage that we've seen in these elections officials isn't new. I mean, we saw it back in 2017 too, when the first Trump administration stood up a commission on elections, tried to get access to voter registration data from state election officials, and they said absolutely not. And in fact, I recall that the Secretary of State of Mississippi, who was a Republican at that time, used some pretty salty language involving jumping in the Gulf of Mexico to respond to that request for data. So look, I think the law here is very clear. The Constitution is very clear. But it is going to take the strength and courage and tenacity of elections officials and communities, for the reasons I was describing before, to make sure we can get there on the smoothest road possible.
Harry, one of the questions that we see coming up that people ask is what's going to happen when the federal government decides that it wants to, for example, take over immigration enforcement, or we've already seen prosecution of a state court judge because she didn't do what the federal authorities thought. I assume when you were in the Department of Justice, the interplay between federal and state law enforcement, how do you think about that in light of what you see now in the Trump administration?
Yeah, well, let me say it is a difference of night and day, Mark. You always worked. Election's a very good example with your state counterparts. Any affection for federalism or any of the previous kind of articles of faith of the Republican Party have clearly been jettisoned in favor of whatever is more powerful. You mentioned the judge. That's part and parcel of an overall kind of hostility toward the systems, state and local, that they think are going to harbor immigrants or push back on federal policy. There is no more kind of respect for federalism, or there is no more kind of principles of administrative law. It all goes toward assertions of power, Trump power, Republican Party power. So let me say, I agree with Hannah, and hers is the most important point. I think the numbers and the kind of overall, like baseball, American kind of culture is the stronger point here. But this may be my last comment, and I will end sort of darkly, because on the legal side of things, you're going to have alderman assertions. Nobody cares about federalism, within the administration. And this is one point where I fear the U.S. Supreme Court, and that, we're talking often about which way will 5 go, or even which way will Chief Justice Roberts go. And even these assertions that you're talking about, something will happen, right? You know this better than anyone. You don't know what the flashpoint's going to be. Right. All of a sudden, here it is after the election. It's a particular thing. Who's going to make the ultimate decision that will be, in fact, settle the controversy? It'll be the U.S. Supreme Court. So, for instance, they've been flirting with years now, this notion of the independent state legislature theory, which would have the impact of really empowering state legislatures, tend to be Republican, disempowering state courts tend to be Democrat. So when the actual sort of flashpoint, roll of the dice happens, it's going to be a federal court that decides. It could be the U.S. Supreme Court that decides it. That'll be worrisome. Nevertheless, I think Hannah and Skye's point of just on the ground, how big the force is, how pro-democratic the forces are on the ground, will really carry the day.
Okay, so we've had a lot of talk about what could go wrong, and I want to end tonight with a little bit of optimism.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go around the horn. I'm going to start with you, Hannah. What gives you hope?
It's the communities that we work in. We have staff on the ground across the 8 states that we're in, and in every single one of them, what they see are communities, as I was referring to earlier. Yes, voting, but more important than that, protecting their own vote and protecting the vote of their communities. I'm talking about voters up north in Wisconsin and Wausau, who, when their mayor literally wheeled their ballot drop box away from downtown on a dolly, said, "You got to bring this back. This is where we vote here." I'm talking about voters who drove across the country to get back to their home states because they're deployed with their military family member, right, to make sure their absentee ballot would count. I'm talking about hundreds of people in Georgia who went before their state board of elections last fall and said, "You have to count these votes. That kind of courage is the thing that gets me up every single morning. We owe it to those voters to keep fighting for them.
Harry?
I have nothing good to say. I've in no way tempered my views of how wicked Trump could be, but I think he's lost. In other words, I think it really matters that he's blundered so badly in these first 100 days. He's looking at 42, 43%. I don't believe he has the cultural, political base from which he can mount the sort of takeover and smothering of democracy that he wants to do. I think that time has passed for him. I think we're going to endure some really terrible damage over the next few years. That'll be very hard to put the pieces together again thereafter. But the basic thing I've had, cold sweats about since November, that he'll actually be able to bring down the democracy. What gives me hope is I think the combination of his own screw-ups and the overall force of the American people, the things that Hannah said, but 85% say you have to stay with the rules, etc. I think his time for really prevailing in the most fearsome way has passed.
I want to thank everyone for sticking with us through this live virtual event. Live events always have their challenges, but we really appreciate you being here. But I mostly want to thank our special guests and our panel of experts. Each and every one of you, Hannah, Skye, and Harry, are doing the hard work of democracy every single day. And I want to give a shout out. If you are not already following Harry Litman on Substack, on his podcast, on YouTube, please do so right now. Learn more about All Voting is Local by going to allvotingislocal.org. Hannah's work is invaluable, and she is the best there is in what is the heartbeat and the lifeblood of democracy, which is local election administration. And of course, Skye Perryman, who is the CEO and president of Democracy Forward, is litigating every single day in court to prevent Donald Trump and the administration from destroying our democracy. But of course, it's all of you who are watching this and listening to this who are really doing the hard work by not letting the cynics win, by not allowing yourself to disengage, by not permitting Donald Trump to destroy our democracy without the public paying attention and fighting back. Again, if you are not already subscribed to Democracy Docket, please take a second to do so. And if you want more content, become a premium member. The links to all of those, to both of those, as well as all of the outlets and platforms of our guests will be available. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to our panelists.
And thank you, Mark.
Thank you.